the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome. This is Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Wade Center, Dr. David Downing, and our theologian producer, Aaron Hill.
Are you saying he's not a doctor?
No, I'm not a doctor, David. I have 2 master's degrees, but no PhD.
Oh, okay.
Womp, womp, womp.
Sounds like Crystal's rubbing it in.
I know, right? Well, I get a different title every time, so that's okay.
I know. Well, it gets boring if you say the same thing
I know.
over
Amateur
and
paper
over.
plane enthusiast, Aaron Hill.
And we are going to talk today about a very important work that was influential upon both C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers. In fact, not long before he died, C.S. Lewis was asked to name other influences on his spiritual life besides George MacDonald. And we just finished a series on Fantastes and how it baptized Lewis's imagination. But in his naming of 4 people, he named 2 experts in mysticism, G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy Sayers. And the book we want to talk about today is Orthodoxy, which was published in 1908. It has never been out of print. We're very thankful to Trevin Wax, who gave us a copy of Orthodoxy, for which he added annotations and footnotes and a good introduction. The origin of the book is Chesterton had written a book in 1905 called Heretics, criticizing all these philosophers from his day and the limitations of their philosophy. And someone says he criticized everybody else without revealing his own philosophy. So Orthodoxy was a response to that critique where he is presenting his philosophy. David, why don't you tell us what you value about Orthodoxy?
Well, I have to mention, you mentioned Trevin Wax. In his introduction, he talks about the quickness of Chesterton's mind, and someone gave Chesterton a number of progressive proverbs, and Chesterton just annotated them very briefly, all in one sentence. So this is a collection of proverbs. The person says, "Truth is one's own conception of things." And Chesterton writes, "The big blunder. All thought is an attempt to discover if one's own conception is true or not." Mm-hmm. And the next one says, "No opinion matters finally except your own." Chesterton adds, "Said the man who thought he was a rabbit." So I enjoyed the intro because it shows what a quick thinker he was and how concisely and aphoristically he could refute someone else's thought. I'm glad he was willing to put down a positive philosophy. You notice often in philosophical discussions, it's much easier to critique someone else's views than it is to explain your own credibly.
Oh my gosh.
I've had people attack my Christian faith, and I said, "Well, what do you believe about reality?" "Well, I believe that there's a divine spark and we should all cultivate the spark." And I go, "Well, is that a personal spark or a pantheistic spark?" And I feel much better about trying to defend my faith when other people are asked to defend their worldview.
Yeah, it's really hard.
Well, I like Chesterton's his aphoristic ability to capture an important truth. Now, sometimes it seems more rhetorical or sophistical. Mm-hmm. One of his critics said he was a logic chopper and a paradox monger. Mm-hmm. But other times, when he says tradition is the democracy of the dead, that is a very concise way to say we should take into account everyone's opinions, not just the opinions of people who are walking around on Earth right now.
Yeah.
And I like it too because it implies balance. He's not saying we have to get back to the old ways and just reinstitute those old traditions.
Right.
No, they are just participants in the democracy. We listen to our contemporaries and we listen to people from the past and evaluate the legitimacy of what all people are saying. And that's one of the things I love about Chesterton is he was just radically committed to the idea of the equality of all people. And part of the equality of all people is those people in the past who had insight. And you can see why C.S. Lewis liked this book, because He talks about chronological snobbery, where you
Right.
don't include those individuals, those brilliant minds of the past.
Yeah. Can I mention a quote at the beginning? And I wanted to ask you about a character. So he's saying that he's going to state his philosophy in a positive way. So he says, I will begin to worry about my philosophy, said Mr. Street, when Mr. Chesterton has given his. So this is one of the critiques of his Heretics book. So he goes on to say, I have attempted in a vague and personal way, in a set of mental pictures rather than a series of deductions, to state the philosophy in which I have come to believe. I will not call it my philosophy, for I did not make it. And so I thought he kind of sets up the book very well by saying, like, this is what I believe, but this isn't just my set of beliefs. There's a broad tradition of Christianity that I'm trying to articulate here.
But as you go through the book, and we should do that as well, go with chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll finish the book at our next podcast. He is presenting how he realized that Christianity was answering a lot of the things he was thinking already.
Yeah.
So there is this personal angle, but once again, he is including the traditional with his own grappling with things.
But it does make the important point that philosophy should be related to reality. It shouldn't just be mental constructs.
Yeah, totally abstract.
In one of his other books, he says, the modern habit of saying, this is just my opinion, but I may be wrong, is entirely irrational. If I say that it may be wrong, I say that is not my opinion. The modern habit of saying, every man has a different philosophy. This is my philosophy, and it suits me. The habit of saying this is mere weak-mindedness. A cosmic philosophy is not constructed to fit a man. A cosmic philosophy is constructed to fit a cosmos. A man can no more possess a private religion than he can possess a private sun and a private moon. I like that quote today. In some ways, Chesterton was a man of his times because he talks a lot about Shaw and Wells and a lot of figures
Ernst Haeckel, Nietzsche.
Right. But in other ways, this critique of subjectivism, I really like the idea that the whole point of philosophy is to try to correspond to reality rather than this radical subjectivism that he was critiquing is still very much with us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And people don't realize how that radical skepticism was implemented as relativism way back in the 19th century.
Right.
So Chesterton inherited this relativistic view of the universe, but then in answer to the relativism, scientists came along and said, well, it's only science that can offer us truth, science that is addressed via logic. And interestingly enough, Sayers actually wrote Chesterton's wife after he died in 1936. And she said, the only reason I am not a logical positivist is because of your husband.
Wow.
Sayers sees herself as, and she read Orthodoxy very early.
Oh, yeah.
Like
how young was she?
Probably 15.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Yeah. So as a teenager.
And as well, she grew up with this sense of Christianity as being this dreary pietism and
outdated.
Well, and just not fun.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's just it's either boring or restrictive and legalistic.
Yeah.
And Chesterton makes it sound so exciting.
Right. There's a kind of a jolliness and geniality. Life is full of gratitude and magic and mystery.
Yeah.
As opposed to that kind of joyless, defensive stance that you so often run into in Christian writers.
Right. And so chapter 1, he starts with the idea of paradox and saying that paradox is part of life. And of course, we've discussed before on our podcast that the essence of Christianity is that God became flesh to save us, and that is the ultimate paradox. Jesus is both fully man and fully God, which seems a logical impossibility.
But in a strange way, that Chesterton associates theology and mystery with fairy tale and magic.
Yeah.
And so you want the mystery and the magic You want the strange and the secure to be brought together, which is what we find in Christian faith.
Yeah. So he kind of sets up the book with this idea of a tale that he would like to write. He says, I have often had a fancy for writing a romance about an English yachtsman who slightly miscalculated his course and discovered England under the impression that it was a new island in the South Seas.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, he would walk around and, like an anthropologist in a foreign land, be observing all of these things with new eyes. And it would reintroduce wonder into the world in a way that he believes all of us should operate under on a daily basis. And so part of his overarching critique here of what he doesn't believe is because it explains away everything in the world that brings wonder, and that wonder gives us gratitude, and that gratitude leads to happiness and joy. And so these scientists, these determinists, are calculating and explaining away everything in the world so that we end up with sort of living in this sort of miserable existence. And so, he talks about fairyland in the Ethics of Fairyland
and
chapter.
Right.
not surprisingly, he read George MacDonald. He loved The Princess and the Goblin. So
he said it changed his whole view of reality. The idea that in our ordinary world, there's a grandmother in the attic who's radiant and magical and can give you a string of providence which will lead you home.
Yeah.
But in the downside, there are gnomes. What does MacDonald call them?
goblins.
Goblins. And so he actually said that reading MacDonald influenced his whole view of reality as being magical and enchanted rather than prosaic.
Let's go back to what Aaron just talked about.
I was going to say for the yachtsman, he the thing that's exciting to him about this is he says, what could be more delightful than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad combined with all the humane security of coming home again?
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, how can we contrive to be at once astonished at the world, yet at home in it?
Yes.
And I feel like that's a really good summary
And there's a
agree.
paradox.
what he's trying to set out. But yeah, it's definitely built on paradox.
Going abroad, which brings you home. And you could see why C.S. Lewis liked this. I remember one of the images Lewis gave of returning to faith is getting off the train station in Oxford and walking in the wrong direction.
Right.
And he keeps walking and can't figure out, well, where are all these beautiful buildings at Oxford? And then he, I guess, starts going up
He
a
suddenly
hill,
turns around
and sees that Oxford was behind him.
Yeah.
And so it's the same idea that you're looking for the place that will minister to you, but you're going in the wrong direction. That's straight out of Chesterton.
Yeah, Lewis said that was an allegory of his whole life. And you're right. Chesterton uses that metaphor of rediscovery often. He says if the Bible floated ashore in England and nobody had ever seen it before, or if someone found it in an archaeological dig, they would say, this is the most transcendent, poetic, profound people that, we've ever met in the ancient world.
Yeah.
But when it's very familiar, you go, sure. I was just reading some of Paul's letters this week and thinking what a wonderful poet he was. I mean, just his power with words, even in translation. But you hear it in church so often, you don't stop and recognize how often he says, the height and depth and breadth.
Yeah.
Nothing can separate us from the love of God.
Yeah.
So another funny way that Chesterton put that, he said, when I was young, I was trying to be advanced and progressive and avant-garde. I was trying to be 10 minutes ahead of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And eventually I discovered I was 1,800 years behind. Christian faith had actually given me this new epiphany that I'd been looking for as a young man.
Well, and then he talks in chapter 1 about trying to get a sense of what he believed and thinking that he was sort of on his own, and then he realizes that all of Christendom is standing behind him. He's not he's not just coming up with these ideas that, he's not the first person to think this.
Right. I like the fact that even the word paradox is paradoxical because dox is the same from which we get the doxology. In other words, that's doctrine or teaching. But para can sometimes mean against, like a parasol is something you put up to shield you against the sun. But the word parallel means alongside of.
Yeah.
So the same para can mean against or along. And that is what Chesterton is doing, is looking at the paradox of things that seem inimical to Christianity, but that are parallel to Christianity.
Yeah.
And how do you work through those?
Yeah.
Right.
And his So his next chapter then is called The Maniac,
Yes.
which kind of would result from, if you're aware of these paradoxes in life. And I know I've encountered people who say, how could you believe Christianity? It's so paradoxical. And he wants to grapple with this.
I like how he opens the second chapter with the quote about, shall I tell you where the men who most believe in themselves? And he goes on to say, like, essentially they're, the men who really believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums. They think that they're Caesar or Napoleon or Jesus or something like that.
Yeah.
And they are thoroughly convinced of it,
Yeah.
Right,
Well, there was actually a study in the early part of the 20th century on self-esteem because everybody was adulating, well, what we have to inculcate in our children is self-esteem. And so how can you give a kid a C? It'll hurt their self-esteem. And in the study, they discovered that in sociological analysis of self-esteem, the people with the most self-esteem are criminals.
Yeah, they compared honor students to students in juvenile hall, and the students in juvenile hall had much higher self-esteem than the honor students in regular high school.
And that's why they feel like, yeah, I can get away with this. I can do this. I deserve to steal this.
Yeah, he says in here, one of the commonest signs of a rotter is that they believe in themselves.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is an important background to understand what he means when he says reason breeds insanity, because that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But the trouble with reason is it can be manipulated. So you can provide a rationale for behavior that is problematic, as a criminal does. And interestingly, in light of our own day, Chesterton gives the example of madness as people who develop conspiracy theories. In other words, they just only pick and choose facts that will fit their conspiracy.
Yeah.
And it's a type of madness. It's not looking for truth. It's asserting your old worldview.
I think the madness comes from thinking reason can explain everything, not recognizing the limits of reason, being open to mystery. He says the poets are willing to float on the infinite, whereas logicians want to cross the infinite, and then they get discouraged by the futility of their efforts. That comes up a lot, the limits of reason. He's not denying reason,
right?
But he's saying you'll go crazy if you think everything can be enclosed within reason. He says it's not poets that go crazy; it's chess players.
Yeah, and he argues that it's the contrast between realizing there's parts of the world you can't explain and you cannot, that there's oddities out there that actually makes you sane. It's when you think that you can explain everything that you actually become insane. And so he says, in the modern psychological novel, the hero is abnormal. The center is not central. But in the old fairy tale, makes the hero a normal boy. It's his adventure that is startling. They startle him because he is normal. And he goes on to say, you can make a story out of a hero among dragons, but not out of a dragon among dragons. The fairy tale discusses what a sane man will do in a mad world. The sober, realistic novel of today discusses what a lunatic will do in a dull world. So he's trying to say you need to, if you embrace this philosophy, and again, he's kind of critiquing this sort of deterministic, positivistic science that you were talking about, Crystal, that wants to explain away everything in the world.
Right.
If you embrace that thing and there's no mystery and there's no wonder in the world anymore, he's saying that's actually going to make you less sane than if you leave some of that mystery in the world or recognize that there are paradoxes that your brain can't resolve.
Well, I see how this very issue influenced Sayers. She had a skeptic write her and say, how could you possibly believe in miracles? Because she had written these radio plays about Jesus's life and miracles. He says it's just not reasonable to believe in miracles. And she wrote him back and she says, well, reason itself you have to take on faith. How do you know that your rationality is reliable, especially, and I believe she got this from Chesterton, especially if you believe in evolutionary determinism. If you are just the result of natural causes, how can you argue that your reason has any correspondence to reality?
Yeah.
That was the argument that got Lewis in trouble with G.M. Anscombe. The way Chesterton puts it, he says, how can we trust that our thoughts correspond to reality if they're just the movements in the mind of a bewildered ape? That was a funny way to put it. He also says, if a man feels that the movements of his own mind are meaningless, then his mind is meaningless and he is meaningless. It does not mean anything to attempt to discover his meaning. So he's going back to that idea that if we just evolved as your brain is a survival mechanism, how can you put any confidence that those thoughts are actually correlating to external reality?
I remember listening to a visiting philosopher, a real big-name philosopher from a very famous university come speak at the college where I was teaching, and he basically gave that same argument as though this was totally new. And I read Chesterton, and I go, Chesterton was talking this way back in 1908.
Yeah.
Well, that argument won't die. There's a whole book called Darwin's Black Box, which really says this is a valid argument. And at the time, Lewis felt rather deflated by Anscombe's critique, and he went back and rewrote parts of Miracles to reflect some of what he'd learned in that debate.
Yeah.
But yeah, you could easily, somebody should write a book on the specific influence of Chesterton on some of our other writers we talk about at the Wade Center.
Yes.
Lewis in Mere Christianity said that if Jesus was not God, he might have been a lunatic on the order of someone who believed he was a poached egg. And some of the critics said, oh, that's such a vulgar, irreverent analogy. But that exact analogy comes up in Orthodoxy. Yeah. He says the same thing about someone thinking they're a poached egg.
Yeah.
Right. He said elsewhere that, I think, isn't that here? He says, well, poets try to get their minds into the heavens.
Oh, I was just going to read that because this is exactly why the Wade exists. How imagination can help us think through these things.
Yeah.
And so those of you listening to this podcast, if you feel the value of it, you might consider your year-end giving to support the Wade.
We'll podcast for food. Yeah, we said that before.
Here is how Chesterton puts it. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. In other words, poets, literary artists, like our Wade authors, are trying to understand the cosmos and reality. And then Chesterton goes on, it is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head. And it is his head that splits. And that's true. Logical positivism was this real hot topic in the early part of the 20th century. And then people just started noticing all the flaws of it.
Oh, it went down in flames, and that's where you get, postmodernism.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely.
Exactly. Even Wittgenstein himself, who kind of developed logical positivism, then questioned his own logical positivism because he became aware of the exigencies of language, and we can't think apart from language.
Well, that's that famous refutation. The logical positivists would say, well, all truth either has to be deductive, it's based on previous logic, like a bachelor is an unmarried man, or it has to be inductive, based upon empirical evidence. And somebody finally said, well, that statement you just made, is that inductive or deductive?
Yeah.
So their whole premise is some ways self-refuting.
Yeah. I like, though, what Chesterton does in this chapter. The first time I read through it, I'm like, why is he going on this? Like, just get to I want you to state what you actually believe. Like, why are you doing this? But rereading it again I don't even know how many times I read this book, but, probably the 7th or 8th time, I realize what he's doing is he's critiquing the worldview that he disagrees with, but he's also mocking it in kind of a way. He's making poets and imagination and a world filled with wonder seem beautiful and something that you would want and something that you would desire, right? So as opposed to the other side, which would say, well, you guys are just, fanciful, living with your head in the clouds, you don't have a connection to reality, kind of make you seem childish, like people who like fairy tales are childish and they don't want to live in the real world, You just want a happy ending at the end of your movie, but I want my ending to be sad and brutal because that's the way the world is. And he's trying to say, is that really how you want to live your life? Is that going to make you happier? And the answer is obviously no. And so he's doing both a positive and a negative argument for why his philosophy is a good way of looking at the world. And I think it kind of sets up the next chapters really well.
Yeah. And he starts one chapter with a psychological truth. People say when someone's a child, they just live in the world of fantasy and fairy tales and magic. and they grow up and they realize that they need to engage in practical politics. And he says, when I grew up, I became disillusioned with practical politics, but I never lost my love of magic and enchantment and wonder.
Yeah.
And that's very true. In some ways, at some point, you do get disillusioned with the so-called conclusions of science or the operations of politics and social engineering. But some of these universal truths that you learned in high school, you learned in childhood, still stay with you.
Yeah, and it kind of traps you in this. Crystal and I were talking about this before we started the podcast. There's a quote. He says, "If a man says, for instance, that men have a conspiracy against him, you cannot dispute it except by saying that all the men deny that they are conspirators, which is exactly what conspirators would do." His explanation covers the facts as much as yours. So he's in this section. He's kind of pointing out like it's very easy once you go down this path to get trapped in a kind of circular reasoning from which you can't escape, and trying to remove all the paradox from the world and remove all the mystery and the wonder leads you down that path.
There's a certain literal truth to that. Paranoid schizophrenia, when people say that aliens are sending me signals or the CIA is trying to kill me, everything you try to say logically, like, well, why would they try to kill you? What have you done? They always have an answer for it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the way their brain works, is they have this closed system. They start with the premise of aliens or the premise of conspiracy. Some of his comments are merely whimsical, but others of them are actually quite psychologically acute.
I know. And he kind of, it's like riding a rough sea. You feel on these waves where you're going up, this is brilliant. And then you come down and you go, what are you saying, GK?
Yeah.
But here's one of the ones
Trevin Wax has an intro. I just wanted to say, following your analogy, at the end of his intro, he says, reading Chesterton is like seeking gold nuggets in a jungle, or it's like riding a roller coaster. And then he ends up by saying, keep the treasure, enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to enjoy the ride when you read Chesterton.
Yes,
and that's why Sayers loved him. She enjoyed the ride. When he was talking about poetry and it operating as medicine, it reminded me, and this is relevant to what we're talking about, the famous autobiography of John Stuart Mill, who is the person who coined utilitarianism to describe this idea invented by his godfather, Jeremy Bentham, that ethics is it's very logical. It's just mathematical. It is the greatest good for the greatest number. And even as a late adolescent, John Stuart Mill just started worrying, well, what happens to us when logic has figured out every single truth? What do we have then? And he went into this severe depression, and then he started reading the poetry of William Wordsworth. And
this is John Stuart Mill you're talking about.
Yes, right? John Stuart Mill. And he illustrates exactly what Chesterton is talking about in this chapter, that poetry is medicine. It was literally, Mill describes it as healing him.
Yeah. By the way, if you ever want to read a really good book about John Stuart Mill, there's one written by Timothy Larson, who's a professor at Wheaton College.
Right.
It's called John Stuart Mill, A Secular Life, and it's sort of refuting the hypothesis that everybody in England at that point had sort of become purely an atheist and they had no spiritual connection. So, but it's a really, really, really fascinating, good book.
Yeah.
Good book.
When we first came to Wheaton 4 years ago, we were talking about Victorian faith crisis, and I was talking to a faculty member I just met. I said, I read this really good book about how many influential Victorians actually came to faith in the 19th century. Their journey was just the opposite of the cliche.
Yeah.
And Tim Larson said, oh, yeah, I wrote that book.
Yeah.
And I go, oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. He is the foremost authority on that.
Here is in this chapter as well, this is chapter 2 of Orthodoxy, something that reminded me exactly of an essay we discussed earlier in the podcast, Meditations in a Toolshed by C.S. Lewis. Chesterton, it's the last page of chapter 2. He says, the one created thing which we cannot look at is the one thing in the light of which we look at everything. Like the sun at noonday, mysticism explains everything else by the blaze of its own victorious invisibility.
It sounds exactly like Lewis.
Yes.
Yeah.
I cannot look at the sun, but by its light I see everything else.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and on that question of the philosopher, he's talking here about what he the way that you have to break out of this kind of thinking. And he talks about it in almost as if it's a miracle. He says, curing a madman is not arguing with a philosopher. It is casting out a devil. The whole business here is that a door must be shut forever. He says, their attitude is really this, that the man must stop thinking if he is to go on living. And so he's saying, by getting rid of this thinking, you put yourself in a situation where the only thing that can save you, he says, he can only be saved by will or by faith. And so he's sort of setting the stakes here for the only solution is one of faith to overcome reason, essentially.
Well, it's interesting how many of his comments, which sound rhetorical, actually, as science and physics and mathematics advance, they continue to ring true. When it comes to, he says that you should accept sometimes the fact that two things are contradictory, accept both of them plus the contradiction. And modern physicists say, well, light behaves like waves and it behaves like particles, and we're not going to decide between waves and particles. We're just going to accept the contradiction.
Yeah, the paradox.
Yeah, there's also a paradox. Sometimes you can't really describe what's going on at the subatomic level except through mathematics. But we've gotten to a point where people have very sophisticated mathematics, like string theory or in theory, brain theory. But it's wonderful mathematics, but people don't know if it's actually true or not. So we've come up to this paradox, which I'm sure that Chesterton would really enjoy.
Yeah.
That we have this very sophisticated set of numbers and calculations, but we don't know anymore if they correlate to reality or not.
Yeah. Well, can we move on to the next chapter?
Yeah.
Which
is quite provocatively called The Suicide of Thought.
Yeah.
And here he starts with, and you see his own biases. He talks about the Reformation, how it shattered Christianity. It's even though this was written in 1908, he didn't officially become Roman Catholic until 1922. But you can see why some people think he was a Catholic much earlier because of his suspicions of the Reformation, which, as he puts it, let vices loose.
Well, the Father Brown stories seem very Catholic, and obviously Father Brown is a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
But at the time he wrote them, he was still officially an Anglican.
Right. But you can usually tell who the culprit is if they're a Calvinist or an American.
Or a rich person.
Well, he definitely has it out for Calvinists. He takes a couple shots of them with predestination in the book here.
Right.
I was just going to mention from this chapter, one of the things that stands out to me is he goes through and he talks about a lot of things, but one of the things that stood out is about humility and the importance of humility and what humility is good for, and good humility and bad humility. So he's saying a man was meant to be doubtful about himself, but undoubting about the truth. This has been exactly reversed. The new skeptic is so humble that he doubts if he can even learn. And then you were talking earlier about doubting even your own, you sort of qualify your own opinion.
Right. Right.
And his point is that, the old humility was a spur that prevented a man from stopping, not a nail in his boot that prevented him from going on. The new humility makes a man doubtful about his aims, which will make him stop working altogether. And so the purpose of the old humility, he says, was to make a man doubtful about his efforts, which would make him work harder. And so one is constructive and leads to good and positive things and restrains sort of your own self-esteem, so to speak, which can lead to you working harder and trusting in other people and trusting in other things besides yourself, as opposed to the new humility, which makes you question everything and what's the purpose of going on. And honestly, I think you kind of see that in the world today is people are starting to go like, what's the point? Why are we doing all this? You start to see a lot of hopelessness and despair. That
the humility becomes a sense of futility. I love the way Chesterton puts it. He says, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And moderns say, I'm not sure I exist, therefore I can't think. So rationality is called into question. Even identity is called into question. The old word identity, now when people are talking about someone's consciousness, they'll tend to say their subjectivity. So they don't really want to stress that there's a core identity there. It's more a center of subjectivity, which definitely moves us away from any sense of objective reality. Even our own being, we're not sure about anymore.
And that's related to his objections to determinism. So not only did he dislike Calvinist determinism. In other words, you have no will. God has decided in advance who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. But he makes this interesting move to say that materialists, rationalist materialists like logical positivists, are determinists as well. It's just rather than God determining everything, it's nature determines everything. You evolve and become what nature determined, the materialism of nature determined you to become. And Chesterton wants to retain that paradox of free will as well as God's ultimate purpose. And that is a paradox as much as Jesus's paradox of being fully human and fully God at the same
waves
time.
versus particles.
Yeah.
Waves versus particles.
Another thing that he attacks in this chapter is the rebellion against religion and the church and any sort of hierarchical authority. And again, you can kind of see him like definitely leaning in a Catholic direction here. But he says, it is rational to attack the police. Nay, it is glorious. He's talking about this in terms of, obviously, they can be abusive. They need accountability. But then he goes on to say, the modern critics of religious authority are like men who should attack the police without ever having heard of burglars. And so one of the points he tries to make in this chapter is the church and religion in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a reason why it needed to exist and why we need religious authority, because there are bad people in the world and because of sin. And there are, in other words, there's a reason why we have rules. It's because people do things to hurt other people, and so we needed to come up with a reason for that. And so, I think he's kind of trying to set up this idea of it's good for us to have some set of religious rules and behaviors that we should follow. Otherwise, we just have sort of chaos. The question is then, what should they be like? But that's a different discussion.
But he does make an interesting point that often a scientific outlook is narrower than a religious outlook.
Yes.
Because a religious person can admit that certain things are rational, they're systematic, they're orderly, but it still leaves room for mystery and even mysticism. Whereas a rationalist has this closed system. He calls it like the spotless machine of rationalism, in which you can't allow the least bit of mystery or miracle. In another book, he says, when someone reports a miracle, such as there was a miraculous healing at Lourdes or someone else, the Christian can go inspect that particular thing with no bias. They believe in the possibility of miracles, but they're not committed to every report of a miracle being true.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas the skeptic, before they even look at the evidence, they have to reject that there was a miracle, there was a healing.
Yeah.
And so he actually says that being someone open to the supernatural makes you more broad-minded than someone who
exactly.
a priori insists that such things couldn't happen.
In fact, he demonstrates that by countering his problem of evolutionary determinism that many scientists were talking about in his day by saying, if evolution simply means that a positive thing called an ape turned very slowly into a positive thing called a man, then it is stingless for the most orthodox. For a personal God might just as well do things slowly as quickly, especially if, like the Christian God, he were outside time. So Chesterton, this is, once again, as early as 1908, is allowing for the possibility of theistic evolution, that God set the process in motion and it happened over time slowly. And once again, he is honoring the Orthodox view of both and. I haven't used that phrase in a long time.
There you go.
Okay, it came up.
And so Christians who just get up and refuse to even allow for the possibility of evolution, what they are doing is a disservice to the faith, because then that makes everybody who says, here's all this evidence, think, oh, well, they're just anti-intellectual.
Yeah.
Well, that's historically Christians have tended to become attached to a particular scientific model. And as it became clear that that scientific model was not true, Ptolemy being replaced by Copernicus, they actually helped discredit Christianity because they brought in more than they needed to in terms of the essentials of Christian faith.
Right. That Christians themselves must be committed to the democracy of ideas. So think of tradition but also in conversation with contemporary scientific theory rather than either or.
Right, right.
Well, let's talk about the ethics of fairyland. We've already kind of touched on it. Elfland, sorry, the ethics of Elfland. But what is the thing that he's trying to talk about in here related to fairy tales? What is the obsession with Elfland or fairyland?
Well, he does a good job at the end summarizing what his main points have been.
Yeah.
I wish he would do that more often. But I think one of the great propositions that we find in all of Chesterton is that life is a mystery and you can't get rid of the mystery, and it's magical. He says life is a surprise, but it's a pleasant surprise. And he really finds that sense of mystery more in fairy tales and children's poetry than he does often in adult writings in which they want to totally banish mystery from the world. So that's an important early concept, is accepting the mystery, embracing the mystery, and even celebrating the mystery.
He repeats that word surprise multiple times in these first 4 chapters and ended up writing a play called The Surprise that wasn't published till after he died. And I know about it because Dorothy Sayers wrote the intro to it.
Oh.
Was it a pleasant surprise?
Yes. But as surprise that is not deterministic. And so once again, he is criticizing both the determinism of Calvinists as well as the determinism of anti-Christians.
Right, materialist.
Materialist.
I wanted to mention his comments on the nature of law. He says that science is the study of the admitted laws of existence. So we have gravity and a lot of other laws. It cannot prove a universal negative about whether those laws could ever be suspended by something admittedly above them. Once again, it reminds me of Lewis. Lewis said, scientists can study nature, but they cannot tell us if there's anything above or behind nature. I mean, the law of gravity is actually just an observed regularity. And people are surprised that the universe is here at all, but they're also surprised that it obeys mathematics. One Christian scientist, said that it's as if we were studying the heavens and we've suddenly discovered that all the heavenly bodies were abiding by the rules of chess. What we thought was a human construct seems to be built into the universe. And Chesterton seems to intuit that long before the scientists did.
Right. And he once again reiterates this idea by describing life as a story and then asserting, well, if it's a story, there must be a storyteller.
Yeah.
And that is another thing that Lewis appropriates, Sayers appropriates. Both of them talk about there is this character named Hamlet, but we know that there was a creator of Hamlet.
Yeah.
Right.
And this whole idea of origins beyond what we can see and empirically evaluate.
Yeah. I like the thing that stood out to me from this chapter, reading it again. He goes on to make the point that because, science is trying to explain away, when done improperly, science is trying to explain away all the wonder and where it can in the world, specifically this logical positivism that he's critiquing in the other chapters. And he goes on to say that, in doing that, it takes the wonder out of the world and it makes us less happy. And so he says, the test of all happiness is gratitude. And I felt grateful, though I hardly knew to whom. And then he goes on, this is actually kind of relevant because it's towards Christmas. He says, could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he put in my stockings the gift of two miraculous legs? We thank people for the birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for the birthday presents of birth? And he goes on to talk about might have been. And then he gives this example of Robinson Crusoe and the list of all the things that he saves from the shipwreck. And he essentially says we should be making a list of those kinds of things in our own lives. And it's only that sense of contingency that this thing might have been lost, that it could be breakable. He says everything has been saved from a wreck. And if we can grab onto that sense of giftedness of the world, that God didn't have to give us to this and that everything is contingent, then we could have that happiness and that gratitude back. And he gives the example of, in fairy tales, this is fascinating because I never really thought about this, but there's a lot of glass things in fairy tales, right? So there's the glass slippers and everything hangs by a glass. Glass ears. And he says this thin glitter of glass everywhere is the expression of the fact that happiness is bright but brittle, like the substance most easily smashed by a housemaid or a cat. And he says that to be breakable, though, is not to be the same as to be perishable. He says, strike a glass and it will not endure an instant. Simply do not strike it, and it will endure 1,000 years. Such it seemed was the joy of man, either in elfland or on earth. The happiness depended on not doing something, which you could at any moment do, and which very often it was not obvious why you should not do. And so he's trying to make here, I think, a point about sin. And in fairy tales, there's always this like singular prohibition, like, don't do this one very trivial thing, or your entire world will come crashing down, or you get turned into a donkey or something like that. And it always seems sort of cruel and tyrannical for the laws to be set up that way. But he's trying to argue that's kind of how life works. Like sin can do that. It can totally destroy your life.
Right.
So I thought that was a really good point that he made in the chapter.
And Sayers, and once again, this may be his influence on her, she is abhorred by the idea that religion is just something you go through these various practices and rituals and get salvation in return.
Mm-hmm.
But she talks about sin as consequences.
Yeah.
And that explains determinism. God created a world in which when you put a hand in a fire, it will burn.
Yeah.
But that's consequences. God isn't punishing you for putting your hand in the fire.
Yeah.
So the same idea of if you decide to just hit the glass, it will break. That's consequences.
Yeah.
And that is a much more subtle way to think of sin than just, oh, God's mad at me, so I have to make him happy by going through the right rituals and practices.
Right.
Purely arbitrary.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he calls them incomprehensible conditions. But like Lewis saying that Christianity is true myth, Chesterton likes to say that fairy tales and Christian faith have these interesting commonalities. And he's got this one paragraph where he says, open a box and the devils escape. That's Pandora.
Mm-hmm.
Turn on the light and love flees. That's Cupid and Psyche. Pluck the apple and you are lost. And so he actually takes the incomprehensible conditions or the prohibitions from classical fables and fairy tales, and he interweaves the story of Genesis. It's very clever rhetorically. I wanted to get in. You spoke about gratitude, and Chesterton says, Oscar Wilde says, we do not value a sunset because we don't have to pay for it. But the way we pay for a sunset is by not being Oscar Wilde. That's a very clever way to expose that kind of glib ingratitude.
Yeah.
It is very true. Gratitude, you have to cultivate it. After a while, what you should be grateful for, you just assume that you deserve.
Take it for granted.
Yeah, you're reading newspaper accounts about what's happening in Ukraine and having no power and all the arbitrary bombing of civilian areas.
Yeah.
And you kind of go, there's no reason that we were born in a place where we have power and we don't have arbitrary bombing of our apartments. But when you see it happening elsewhere, you almost have to just thank God that our daily life is so settled and stable and secure.
Yeah.
Because if you have several days in a row, you sort of lose that sense of gratitude.
Yeah.
And the worst thing is to feel that somehow you're owed that security.
Oh, yeah.
That it, that you earned it somehow.
Oh, that's the worst. Yeah. Well, I was reading a book over Thanksgiving that was talking about the origins of Native American people in North and South America. And they were just giving a description of life in northern Canada up in the Arctic Circle, like in 800 CE, and these tribes that were moving around. And I just thought, man, I am grateful that I am in this house that has heating. Yeah. And we have a turkey that, we just bought from a store, and we're going to heat it in the oven. And it just made me grateful for all the sort of modern conveniences of life that we take for granted. And I think Chesterton has a real gift for doing that. He says in the chapter, it is a good exercise in empty or ugly hours of the day to look at anything, the coal scuttle or the bookcase, and think how happy one could be to have brought it out of the sinking ship onto the solitary island.
Right.
Yeah. And people today forget that happiness, the word originated in the idea of a happenstance, that something surprised you. It just happened. And hence Chesterton's emphasis on surprise, whereas today people feel like, well, I should be happy all the time. And so they're constantly buying more things, spending more money, changing partners, thinking that, well, happiness is something that should be sustained. If more people were just awestruck by a sunrise or a sunset, they wouldn't have to pay money.
Well, it also, I mean, because he actually makes a point in here about monogamy, and he says, for him, I guess because of his shape and his stature, which we talked about, he says, keeping to one woman is a small price for so much as seeing one woman. To complain that I could only be married once was like complaining that I had only been born once. For him, the idea of sleeping with a bunch of women was, it sort of lost sight of the beauty and wonder of sex and the fact that, he was grateful that someone would love him in the first place. And by hanging on to that gratitude, to him, monogamy didn't seem like a bore or a punishment or something like that. And I think he's trying to, it's back to that glass. It's like the glass is meant, say a glass is meant to hold something, and it can do that for generations if you treat it with care. But if you just go around smashing it, then it's worthless, it gets to be thrown away. And so there's these rules that are built into the universe, and they're not cruel things that God sets up because he's arbitrary or he wants
it's about
to rob
consequences.
us of happiness. Yeah.
And it's also about human nature. You mentioned monogamy. He says elsewhere, people who live only for amusement will not stay amused for long.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you try to
Happiness.
pursue pleasure relentlessly, it loses its savor. And that same pleasure, it's almost like what happens with addicts. They need a larger and larger dose to get the same high feeling that they had from an early dose. You can do that not just with drugs, but a lot of things, pleasures in life that you take for granted.
Yeah, he says, a man is a fool who complains that he cannot enter Eden by 5 gates at once.
Right.
Yeah. Another thing that he does in this final chapter that we're discussing today, and next podcast we'll finish the book, but he mentions Ernst Haeckel, and I find that fascinating because it reminds me how Chesterton was way ahead of his time in denouncing eugenics. And Haeckel was a promoter of eugenics, of manipulating things to have the preeminent races survive. And Haeckel is often cited as one of the main influences on Nazism and Hitler. You get rid of people that aren't promoting racial purity. And from the start, Chesterton took a stance against that, whereas most scientists were saying, well, this is just scientific fact, that, and people don't realize when Darwin wrote his book on natural selection, he compared it with domestic selection, meaning controlling race and only having people have intercourse. I was trying to.
You guys couldn't see the hand motions that Crystal was trying to make.
Sexual union.
That would purify the race.
Yeah.
And wow, Chesterton didn't care how many brilliant people said, well, that's unreasonable to resist eugenics.
Yeah. Well, it's what's the despicable part of it is that it was couched in this idea that they thought that was going to make people happier. Right, that it was going to improve because
the human race would be better.
Yeah,
right?
people are only sad and depressed and poor because they have bad genes or whatever, and so they thought if they could breed that out of everybody. I mean, there were ideas of like some sort of a lottery where everybody got assigned a number, and then some planer on high was going to assign. I mean, it sounds like something out of some horrible dystopian novel.
But this was serious scientific theory back in the early part of the 20th century.
In Gaudy Night, there's a woman who wants to have scientific marriages.
Yes,
where only smart people marry smart people.
And that was 35, of course, right before Hitler came to the fore.
I was going to say, led straight to Auschwitz. So
Right. Another thing I wanted to mention about, he's great at his metaphors and analogies, as is C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
But in one place he says, we're on the wrong side of the tapestry. The things that happen here do not seem to mean anything. They mean something somewhere else. Somewhere else, retribution will come on the real offender. Here it seems to fall on the wrong person. But I love that idea that we're looking at the wrong side of the tapestry. We can make out vague shapes, but we really can't see the specific nature of the picture
Yeah.
of the cosmos or of life.
Right.
Some of his master metaphors are one of the most compelling things about
Right.
reading Chesterton.
Yeah.
Right. That they help us think. Metaphor helps us think so much better than mathematical equation.
Right. I just keep coming across these quotes that I want to quote. My education is the period during which I was instructed by somebody I did not know about something I did not want to know.
Yeah.
I enjoyed rereading this section of Orthodoxy because a while back I had discovered an essay he wrote on the occasion of his birthday, and he talked about the side of life that's full of gratitude and recognizing
Right.
the things that are a gift. And I think that's something that always stands out to me from Chesterton. It was obvious that he cultivated that attitude in his own life, and that idea of in the empty hours of the day, looking around and being grateful for books that are on a shelf or something like that is a way to recapture that wonder and mystery in life. And I think that's a good legacy that Chesterton leaves, even if he's not the most systematic theologian and thinker. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And some things when you read Chesterton, it'll drive you crazy. So I have all these little frowny faces in the margins of my books. But then again, like the roller coaster, you come up to a beautiful insight that says, this is why Lewis and Sayers loved Chesterton.
Right. Lewis said he loved him for his goodness. He said, I would have thought he's the kind of author I would not want to read, but somehow he said, your taste in books is like your taste in the opposite sex. You never quite know in advance what's going to captivate you. But I do think in many ways, the charm of Chesterton, it is in the aphorisms, but it's also in the attitude rather than what he calls mental deductions. This constant stress on wonder, gratitude, openness to mystery, humility. There's a kind of spiritual health behind the aphorisms and behind the theology, which comes through, and there's a kind of a spiritual buoyancy, which is very energizing to read and healing to read, I think.
There's a lot of apologetics. I spent a great deal of my life being obsessed with that world. A lot of apologetics, it just ends up making you feel more bitter and negative.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you just walk around poking holes in other people's arguments and saying, oh, well, you spent your entire life working on this Oxford scientist, but I can find, several flaws in your theology.
Right.
And it does the opposite of what Chesterton is saying we should do. And so I feel like that's one of the benefits of reading him. He's really great at very quickly, just sort of, thrust and parry and return the attack. But then he very quickly moves on to a positive case. The world is beautiful. He says, I want to refer to the cosmos with a diminutive because I want it to be personal and something that is appreciated as opposed to talking about the vast bigness of space and things like that.
Yeah, right.
So he reintroduces that sense of wonder to you. He's not shy about critiquing, but that's one of the benefits of reading Chesterton.
And
I agree.
that very argument you just mentioned, Aaron, is his approach to people who say, well, how can I believe in a God? This universe just goes on and on and on. There can't be a God beyond that. And Chesterton says, well, why not? Have wonder about it, the surprise of discovering new galaxies as astronomers are doing all the time.
Well, that's another thing that Lewis picked up. He said, the idea that significance is tied to size doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, an elephant would be more important than a human being.
Yeah, right.
And I think he got that idea from Chesterton.
Yeah.
Chesterton says, if you're imprisoned by your own materialistic thoughts, and someone says, well, the universe is larger than we realized, that's like telling a prisoner, well, outside of your cell, we're expanding the prison, and it's much larger than it used to be. But
It's like,
it
so
doesn't
what?
do you any good.
Who cares?
So once again, those humorous and insightful analogies keep coming through.
Yeah.
But I would just say if you like apologetics, and some people come to Chesterton to read him for the apologetic side of things, I think he gives you a better perspective of, here's a better way to practice it and pointing people to wonder and gratitude.
Mm-hmm. It's about poetry, the
Well, he
power
also
of
says
poetry.
the church is bigger on the inside than it is from the outside, which Lewis picks up several times.
Oh, right.
So my final remark would be Chesterton was bigger on the inside than on the outside.
Wow.
And that's saying a lot because he was big on the outside. I didn't read this for a long time because the title was so boring.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that such a charming author and such a witty author would have such a dry title for this book.
Yeah.
But don't be put off by the title. We'll do the second half the next podcast.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.